Hello, everybody. My name's Richard Whatmore, and I teach intellectual history at the University of St Andrews. I'm going to start, as I always do, in the 18th century with an early example of the National Student Survey. The person who filled in his response was Adam Smith, the famous sage of Kirkcaldy, and he described his experience in the early 1740s at the University of Oxford. And he said, in the University of Oxford, the greater part of the public professors have, for these many years, given up altogether even the pretense of teaching. And Smith had comments on Oxford and Cambridge in general as sanctuaries in which exploded systems and obsolete prejudices found shelter and protection after they had been hunted out of every other corner of the world. Now, what Smith meant was that Oxbridge had been taken over, in his view, by a political ideology. The political ideology was Jacobitism, the view that you needed to kick out the Hanoverian monarchs and replace them with the Stuart line, the legitimate line as it was seen by Jacobites. And Smith thought that university teaching goes to pot as soon as universities become political vessels, and that's what you have to avoid at all costs. The other point about universities in the 18th century is that sometimes it was difficult to get a job, and that getting a job depended on your political or religious opinions. The classic example here is David Hume, Smith's great friend. Some people would say that Hume is one of the greatest philosophers who's ever lived, but he couldn't get a job in a Scottish university because he was considered to be religiously heterodox. For Hume and for Smith, the most important thing of all is to avoid universities becoming, I suppose, the handmaidens to politicians. As soon as politicians take control, you're in trouble. One of the reasons they were worried about politicians is because they worried more generally about enthusiasts and projectors. Enthusiasts are people who tell you there are easy solutions to problems, and projectors are people who say, if you elect me or if you embrace my system, then I'll solve all your problems and we're all going to be able to live happily ever after. So I think it's worth going back to that philosophy, because it remains the case that we need to be worried about projectors and enthusiasts and fanatics today, just as we were in the 18th century. Now, I just want to give one more slide. It's from the end of the 18th century, and we have Henry Dundas, who was a minister and a politician. Some people called him the King of Scotland, and he's sitting on boxes on the left-hand side beside William Pitt, the Prime Minister. And if you look at the boxes, it lists his sinecures. And one of his sinecures is the position of Chancellor of the University of St Andrews. And it showed the extent to which universities in these days were really political footballs. And the lusting after place and power and patronage was so extensive and deemed to be so grotesque that you have all of the placemen flying over from Ireland into Pitt's imperial pouch. And as an individual, as a politician, as an academic, you would search for places and gongs. And I think that's also obviously a very bad thing and a lesson from the 18th century to the present. Of course, one of the things that we have to acknowledge about the 18th century is that the academic world, especially as it was in the 19th century too, was dominated by men. And obviously, one of the wonderful things about our world, however many crises universities have faced, it's much more diverse. There are far more women in prominent positions, and it's the norm for university students to think that they're members of diverse cohorts and that they would, of course, expect to be taught by women and to have fellow women students. So that's a genuine revolution. And I think we shouldn't ever get away from the fact that there's an enormous amount of progress despite the often the great problems that universities have faced, say, in the last 20 or 30 years. Now, if we try and learn from history, then we would say that universities normally depend on politicians, and we can't tell how politicians are going to come out of the current crisis and what demands they're going to make, or whether they're going to be projectors or enthusiasts or fanatics. So we have to wait for that. But as an intellectual historian, I've said that I study the history of ideas, and one of the things that people have said to me in the past, sometimes critical people, is that, well, look at you, all you teach is dead white males, and therefore you're necessarily irrelevant to this increasingly diverse world. And intellectual history as a subject, it always needs to be defended, because obviously, as I mentioned, I think you can still learn from people like Hume and Smith and a host of other actually men and women in the 18th century, philosophers like Catherine Macaulay, Mary Wollstonecraft. I could go on and on. The accusation of being dead white males, I think, is a mistake. But one thing that we've tried to do at St Andrews, and I've done it in other places where I've worked, is to try and create a home for intellectual historians. And the reason for mentioning this is that if there's a future to higher education, what people are going to say to us is, how do you make yourself relevant? How do you justify your subject? How do you make yourself attractive to students? How do you bring in students? How do you contribute to the world of learning? And especially I suppose you could call it a latter-day republic of letters. How do you contribute? And what we've tried to do in intellectual history is to always record talks. We record visitors. We interview authors to talk about new work in intellectual history. We have longer interviews with senior figures in the field. And what we've tried to do is create a virtual home, I suppose. And in some ways, the COVID crisis, it hasn't affected us in the sense that we have this virtual home and we get, hundreds of thousands of downloads of the material that we put up. We have people clicking and downloading the material. It's all open access from across the world. And we did that really because we realized that we were in a field that needed defending and it needed justifying. And we had access to scholars in lots and lots of places. So although the Institute is based in St Andrews, it involves the work of people all over the place. So the next slide is the website of the Institute. And I'm just going to go through and show you briefly some of the things you can do, because although it might, I don't know whether it looks flashy or not, but you might think, oh, well, that's impressive. But it really is myself and a PhD student who's techie, because I'm not technically minded myself, but with other faculty, but with the core PhD student putting up a lot of the material that we generate. We add material on a regular basis. So some of the things we do is teaching intellectual history, where we put lectures online by young faculty, older faculty. And the thing that's really a shock here has been that people haven't been recorded in their lives. It's extraordinary that many brilliant teachers have not been recorded. There's no record of their voice. There's no record of their expertise and their brilliance. And we've tried to change that. And we even get people to record lectures by reading out papers sometimes, because we think it's so important. We also do interviews with leading intellectual historians just to prove that there are major leading female intellectual historians. Here we have one with Anne Thompson from the EUI. As I said, we do interviews with authors about new work. We just do short 20-minute interviews with people about their books. And we make them freely available to download. We also collect the papers of intellectual historians, because the idea was really to make a permanent home, so that intellectual prominent academics, we think the papers of academics are important. We've made a home for them. We scan some of the material and we put it online. And we also work with special collections at St Andrews to catalogue and to curate all of the material. And the last thing that we do to flag it all up is we have a site called Intellectual History in 1,000 Manuscripts that we created recently. There's only 2 items on it where we actually put online some of our holdings just to flag up the material that we've got. And I think to conclude that we have to appear relevant, we have to be relevant, we have to genuinely be global. And if we want to be global, the thing that we have to do is much more online engagement. I've never had a problem with being recorded online. I've never had a problem with online lectures. And I know that lots of people actually have contacted me in the past and said, well, I can't make it to St Andrews. Why don't you have an online course, a master's program, or some kind of program that they could take? And I think for a lot of us, that seems to be a pretty good future. And for me, given that you can go outside the academy and attract students who you wouldn't normally attract, there's a wider participation argument there too. So for me, that's all a good thing, and that is the future, I hope.